You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is the president of Washington and Lee University, Will Dudley. President Dudley was previously the provost and professor of philosophy at Williams College. He's the author of two books, Understanding German Idealism and Hegel, Nietzsche and Philosophy, Thinking Freedom. He's the editor of volumes on Kant and Hegel and has published numerous academic articles. And he is the supervisor of my supervisor's supervisor. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Will Dudley. Thanks so much for joining me.
I'm glad to be here, Jeff.
Yeah, this is great. So this is my first time having an in-person episode. I've had maybe 25 or so of these. You're the first person to do this in person.
Well, our offices are probably 50 yards apart, so it's easy to do in person.
Yeah, Lexington, Virginia is rural. We don't,
right.
Not usually near the guests. So you've come on the podcast to talk about values, to talk about missions and organizations, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay.
So how do you, when you think of the values of an organization, what role does that play?
Well, I think it depends a lot on the kind of organization it is, probably. And in nonprofit higher education, we're a mission-driven institution. So I think it plays a pretty central role because we're not here to make money. We're here to serve a mission that explicitly incorporates values that we're trying to live by and instill in young people.
And how do you promote those? Like, how do you keep those central?
I think there are a number of different ways. So one thing I like here at Washington Lee University is we have what I regard as an excellent mission statement. It's 2 sentences long. You want me to recite it?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Washington Lee University develops students' capacities to think freely, critically, and humanely, and to conduct themselves with honor, integrity, and civility. Graduates will be prepared for lifelong learning, personal achievement, responsible leadership, service to others, and engaged citizenship in a global and diverse society. That's our mission.
I should say that was with no notes.
That was with no notes?
That'll be off the cuff.
One reason I can do that is because I talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
So that's what, and also because I think it's important enough, I actually teach a whole philosophy seminar on it. I did last fall and I will again this fall, basically a philosophical exploration of what do all those words mean? Because as a philosopher, I don't like to use words unless I think hard about what they mean. So, but the university has a great mission statement that predates me. It's concise and it says very clearly, what we're about. And the first sentence says we're here to develop young people's cognitive abilities and certain character traits. And then the second sentence says, if we've done that job well, they will be prepared to live lives of consequence in a variety of important ways.
And so how do you make that happen? So we think of in organizational behavior a difference between what we call espoused values and enacted values. Yeah. So your espoused values, those are the values that you claim that you have. That's the stuff that's really easy. That's the stuff that you can put on a website. You can put that on a coaster. You can put it on whatever marketing material you want. You can put your espoused values. And then your enacted values are the values that actually happen. It's what people feel and see and touch. And so what happens with a lot of organizations, and I'm not talking about Washington and Lee, is that there's a tension between these two things. Because if you say that you're one thing, and then you go to the employees and you say, well, what's going on? What do you think about that? They'll literally start laughing if the espoused values and the enacted values don't link up. So how do you not just create that kind of a mission statement, but how do you get it to actually be felt on the ground?
Right. So I don't think there's one simple button you can push or one simple lever you can pull when you're, in an organization of this size, which is roughly 2,000 students and 800 employees. It's a lot of people, and the work that they do is very distributed, and people have very different roles and different experiences every day. So don't want to oversimplify what it takes to sustain the values of the culture. I think I think you do have to talk about them, and talking, as you just pointed out, is insufficient because they have to be lived. But I think it's necessary. You have to remind people, this is the kind of community that we intend to be. As you said, if there's too great a gap between what you say we are and what people experience, they will become cynical very quickly. In my experience here, people's perception of that gap. I mean, no place is perfect. And of course, this place isn't perfect. Sure. So values are always aspirational. There are always ways in which we're, falling short. But it helps to have stated values so that when you fall short, you can point to them and say, this isn't who we want to be. This isn't our best selves. Let's aspire to be better in a particular respect. As the president, I run my mouth for a living. And so, sure. One thing I do is I do talk about these in a lot of different contexts. I talk about them at new employee orientation. I talk about them at, I teach a seminar on them. And for the 15 students who take that class, they think harder about these things than they ever have or ever will. But I think the fact that I'm teaching a class on the mission statement, people notice that well beyond the people who are actually in the class. Mm-hmm. So that sends a certain kind of signal. Did you attend graduation this past year?
Yeah.
So my commencement speech, in large part, was on the theme of responsible leadership, which came out of my class and the mission statement. So I think that talking about them often and in a variety of contexts, reminding people what our values are, and that I know what they are and that I care about them, and I think that's a big part of it. And then that then helps us hold ourselves and other people accountable, so that if we say that we are dedicated to critical thinking or free thinking, we need to be the kind of place at which, in fact, we invite a wide variety of speakers here, and we behave civilly even toward those people with whom we disagree, right? I mean, that's in our mission right. statement. And so in an academic community, we try to live that every day.
So we have what are core values, and those are the ones that are enduring and never change. And we have aspirational values, so the ones that we aspire to have. And I was working for an airline, and there was a really interesting contrast there.
The only industry that has more confusing pricing than higher education is the airline industry.
Or the healthcare.
Well, that too. You're right. Absolutely.
And so they, so the airline, when I was working there, the airline had a thing that we are not hierarchical. Was one of their main statements. And what they meant to say was we aspire to be non-hierarchical. Right. And I remember there was a big thing that came down from the CEO and throughout the company, and everybody started talking about that one statement. Because it was one of the most hierarchical places you could possibly be. And so for the CEO to say we are not hierarchical, it falls on deaf ears. So usually within a mission, you can get away with a little bit of aspiration, but the bulk of it needs to be core values, the kind of that everybody agrees on.
Right.
I was thinking that how enduring should core values be? And what I mean is, should we aspire to have the same core values at Washington Lee or any place today that we have 20 years from now? Or those things that we should be constantly reflecting on and maybe periodically reevaluating what our values are?
I don't know if I think there's a generalizable answer to that. I think that in general, if you have a good set of core values that make sense for your institution, they are not likely to need revision very often. But I'm also a philosopher, I'm a philosopher by profession because I'm a philosopher by nature. I'm someone who is I habitually ask questions, and I like to believe that no question is ever out of bounds. So I think it's an excellent question to ask yourself, why do we have these values? What do these values mean? It's really what my class is about. Have you read our strategic plan, Jeff?
Highlights, yes.
Highlights.
Okay. I have.
All right, we're going to get you to read the whole thing. We're actually
not read the whole thing.
We're going to get you a glossy copy. The pictures make the ideas look even smarter. So the university has a strategic plan, which I think is important. And the strategic plan, which we developed over about 18 months in a pretty inclusive process, begins with the mission statement of the university. It's printed in there. And then it tries to articulate what are the distinctive strengths of this institution, what makes us, what defines us in contrast from other institutions. And it is both, it's both a statement of who we are, but it's also an aspirational document of how would we like to become a better version of ourselves. So actually the production of that document made very concrete for me this question that you're asking, because you don't want to shy away from being clear and direct about what you think your strengths are, but you also don't want to be complacent and pat yourself on the back and say, we're all the way there and we don't have work to do. So in that document, actually, we articulate 4 distinctive strengths of this place. One is the kind of community that we are. One is our distinctive curriculum. One is our commitment to good citizenship as an institution, and one is the distinctiveness of our beautiful and historic campus. So we're proud of all 4 of those things, but that doesn't mean that we are perfect citizens or that our curriculum couldn't be better or that our community is exactly what we want it to be.
But those are as central values, those seem to endure.
They do, and I think they should certainly. I think of the strategic plan as kind of a guidebook for the next 10 years. Over the next 10 years, how do we, hopefully 10 years from now, we will be able to say we are an even better version of Washington and Lee than we were 10 years prior. And, but I think those core characteristics and the values will remain the same. Now, whether they'll be the same 50 years from now, I don't know. But fortunately, that's not my problem. Yeah. Right?
It probably will be different. And that's why, so one of the most influential articles about this is Collins's article in Harvard Business Review, which I sent over to you beforehand. And he claims that core values should endure in an organization throughout its life. Yeah. And this really is one of these seminal articles. And subsequent commentaries have said, that's a little bit far reaching, right? Mm-hmm. And we would actually expect that with 50 years from now or 100 years from now, the values that are core to any company or organization ought to probably change. There'll be some that stay the same. But think about it, Washington and Lee, there's maybe 15 different items in the mission statement. And we would actually expect, like maybe if you hashed it out, 13, 15 different items. Yeah. We might expect that in 50 years or 100 years that some of those are more relevant than others, given that the times have changed.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it's hard to imagine a university, right? We're a small university. We are a liberal arts. We offer a liberal arts education. We've been doing that for more than 2.5 centuries. It's hard to imagine a liberal arts institution that is not committed to thinking freely and critically.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
It's hard to imagine one that is not aspiring to produce graduates who are lifelong learners, for example. So I actually think our mission statement does a good job of, I think if you've done a good job of specifying your core values, it ought to be hard for you to imagine them changing.
Yeah.
But you also ought to be open to the possibility that the world will have changed enough 50 years or 100 years hence that they might change. I mean, I love working in a school that's 270 years old and that has been committed to the value of liberal arts education for that long. And part of my job as the president is to make sure that the institution is robust enough that 100 years from now, it can still be doing this really well.
When you think of people who come to an organization, so we've covered some of the value side on the organization, how much should they expect their values to already align to the place that they're coming to versus I'll just give it a shot and maybe my values will shift or maybe they won't, but I don't feel the need to have a value alignment?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess I faced it personally, so I was at Williams College in Massachusetts for not quite, but almost 20 years before I came to Washington and Lee. And I was there for 13 or 14 as a full-time philosophy professor, and then became the provost or chief academic officer there. And at a certain point, I was receiving inquiries from headhunters running searches for college presidents. And I had an excellent job at an excellent institution. And so I was fortunately in a position where I didn't need to leave unless I wanted to. And it was important to me. I was not interested in being a president for the sake of being a president. I was only interested in being a president if I could be at the kind of institution where I felt excited and proud to be there. And for me, in part, that was about what I know and love are small liberal arts institutions. But then within that, there's wide variety in terms of the particular places and their histories and their geography and kind of the values that they foreground. And so, not to say that Washington and Lee was the only place that could have been attractive to me, but I was actually very drawn to it in the search process to see how clearly it could state, this is who we are, this is who we've been for a long time, these are some of the abiding things that we care about, and they're things that align with me and that drew me here. And I guess I would not, when we're looking for jobs, we're not always fortunate to be choosy, but right. I understand that. But it's awfully nice when you go to a place where you feel like the values are aligned with yours. And I would hope that I would hope that most employees coming here feel like the values that we are committed to are appealing to them. And I would hope that living and working here, that appreciation would deepen. Being committed to being the kind of place that where people speak to each other and people treat each other with civility and decency and respect one another. I mean, that's the kind of place I would like to work, and I hope other people do too.
So I just want to kind of reflect on, this is the broad theory of, one of the broad theories of culture, which we call attraction, selection, attrition. And that the way that culture is formed in many organizations is this kind of 3-step process, that there's a certain culture that a place has, and then it attracts candidates that want to be in that place. Let's say like Goldman Sachs has a particular reputation for being ruthless. Yeah. At other companies, right, they might have at Google, they have a reputation for being a very flat organization, right, that's got a fun has a fun culture to it. And so the people that apply to that's already a subset. Yeah. Then the next layer is selection, where the company then reflects back on those people and says, okay, of the 1,000 people that applied, there are 10 that might work in this culture, or 20, culture being a part of it, right, that are quote unquote fit. And then there's attrition. So those that come into the organization, right, there's a whole process of, well, the next layer, did they work out? They could be, right, they could be fired, they could decide to leave. And so the people that leave often are the ones that do not hold up that culture, and the people that stay tend to hold it up. There's two parts to this, though. You can see the upside and the downside, right? The upside is that you over time end up with a very strong culture. The downside is that it presents challenges for decision making, for diversity, for a whole host of issues where cultures get formed and values get shaped, where it can become homogeneous. I wanted to see what you think kind of about the attraction, selection, attrition.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably going to be interestingly different if you're looking at the corporate world in contrast to the academic world. So I think that what you just described is certainly operative in the academic world, and I think there are advantages to that. If you think you have a good culture and you would like to sustain it, then that dynamic you just described is nice. You attract people who are attracted to that culture, and you retain the people who are most appreciative of that culture and contributing to it. And I do think we have a good culture by and large that we want to sustain. But in the academy, unlike in the corporate world, responsibility and authority and culture are much more highly distributed. And certainly among the faculty who have a very high degree of autonomy, and both at the departmental level and at the individual level, and then of course faculty members who are successful receive tenure, and that gives them tremendous ability to be to live by their own lights and to be critical of the institution with impunity. And those. So the academy.
I'm not a thorn. I'm not a thorn in your side just yet.
Well,
I'm untenured.
Yeah, you will be. And that's okay. I mean, that's okay. Yeah. That's healthy. I mean, it's one.
Yeah.
I think the academy has built in a very strong, healthy corrective. That, the worry about conformity.
Yeah, it doesn't exist here.
It is not. That's not at the top of our list.
Well, because universities tend to be communal cultures where people get along really well. They're polite, but they have an incredible diversity of opinions, and that tends to exist at universities.
Yeah, I think that is correct. It's fair to say. If I think back to before I became an academic, and I worked for just under 3 years in the corporate sector at AES Corporation in the energy industry, and that at the time was a small, rapidly growing, privately held company, and they had 4 core corporate values: fun, fairness, integrity, and social responsibility. And I actually remember getting there and being a little bit cynical about that. But then, I can point to examples though where all of those played out, and I have, a couple of thoughts on that place relevant to what you were just asking. One is that it was a place also that it prided itself on hiring very capable people and giving them tremendous autonomy and not a lot of direct supervision. Essentially, they believed that people could accomplish the most when they had free rein to use their talents and exercise their judgment. And people either thrived in that environment or they washed out very quickly. And if you liked it, if you liked being around really smart people with a lot of autonomy, and you were capable of that yourself, it was really an exhilarating place to work. But it weeded people out pretty quickly who did not swim in that environment. I was also thinking about, you talked about changes in fundamental values, and sometimes those can come from within an institution as it changes. Sometimes they're external shocks. So when I was there, the company went public, and that was fascinating to see from the inside. And after roughly a decade of being a private company with these 2 founders building these values in deeply, all of a sudden, Wall Street analysts were asking questions about, what is best for the shareholder, and they got
quarterly returns and
quarterly returns, and they got very nervous about fun in particular as a corporate value. And in fact, in the prospectus for the IPO, I'm pretty sure there was actually a paragraph or a footnote in there identifying fun as a potential business risk. So, from
the shareholder perspective, it might be.
Yeah.
Which it's unfortunate.
Yes, indeed. Because
so how did it shift? How did it actually shift after the IPO?
Well, I didn't stick around that much longer after the IPO. I went off to grad school and became a philosopher. But it
was enough to scare you off to grad school.
No, it wasn't that. It was not that scared me off. I actually had a boss. So we were in the business of buying and owning and operating power plants, and I worked on one big deal over in Britain. And at the end of that, was trying to decide what to do next. And my boss said, everybody should buy 1 power plant in his life, but after that, they're all the same. And I thought, that's actually pretty good advice. And I bought 2 power plants, and that was enough.
I wonder how many philosophy professors have bought power plants.
I don't know.
You might be it. That might be
Right.
the only one.
It might be the intersection of that world. That's right. But the going public made an immediate difference. A company that had been focused on the long term and the horizon and building a culture was instantaneously focused on quarterly results because it had to be. But of course, it also made possible lots of things, right? There was an infusion of capital that made the company accelerated the growth trajectory, and now it's a truly global enterprise that bears no relation to the small company that I joined in 1991. It's all over the world.
Yeah, and this is part of a growth company, right? So one of the biggest challenges in an institution that is growing rapidly is the capacity to keep culture. And the faster right. Washington and Lee has a very steady student population,
right.
A steady faculty population, right. But it tends to be in the for-profit sector where if you're growing at 30% personnel per year, right. The casualty of that is often culture.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I have to imagine it because I haven't lived it. And my experience in the corporate sector, I was very young. I was 23, 4, 5. I certainly wasn't. I didn't have leadership responsibility for sustaining a culture, but I don't. I'm very mindful of the point that you just made as the president of Washington and Lee. I think you need to be very cautious about growing an educational institution because you can very quickly and accidentally lose some of the cultural traits that are important to the place. We have 1,800 undergraduates and 350 law students, and that means that faculty members know each other personally, and they know each other across departments. And as you grow into I don't know that there's a magic number, but when you cross some threshold, that level, that kind of relationship isn't possible, and the institution becomes more like an umbrella with a lot of separate centers. And I really love being part of a small educational institution where everybody can feel connected to the whole and not just to their department.
Do you think that organizations should have unique values from sister companies or sister universities, or should they all draw from a common pool?
There have to be some commonalities, right? So if we think about great national liberal arts colleges, the schools in that category are going to have a commitment to thinking freely and critically, for example. And so there are going to be some common values. Each place will have its own distinctive history, its own particular geographic location, the reason it came to be, the things that it has accomplished along the way. And so over time, those can become part of what defines the place. So here at WNL, for example, we have 1,800 students. We draw students from all 50 states and 25 countries. We are a national liberal arts institution. But we have, you work in it. We have an undergraduate school of commerce, economics, and politics. And you don't find that at other liberal arts institutions. And the reasons for that are sort of historically accidental. Mm-hmm. So they started for, not out of a core value, but they've now been around long enough that that's part of what defines us. We're the place where you can get a great liberal arts education and also study business and accounting and journalism and engineering. And that's now part of what makes this institution distinct from some of the others within the same category. And each one would be able to point to things like that I think often mm-hmm. begin as accidents, but eventually become your identity.
Have there been events that you can think of in WNL's history that have been, a monumental event that have shifted or changed the value structure?
I think one of the most significant changes at Washington and Lee was a decision to become coeducational, which happened here relatively late. in comparison to other similar institutions. So the first women entered Washington and Lee as full-time students in the fall of 1985. That's actually the same year that I went to college. So there are no female alumni of Washington and Lee older than I am. So the first class of women first graduated in the class of 1989. The school was more than 200 years old at that point. The school was 230 something years old when it went coeducation. So there was a very, very long tradition of this being an all-male institution, which many American schools had been, of course. And there were an awful lot of W&L people who thought about being all male as so fundamental to the school's identity that they couldn't imagine it being Washington and Lee if it were coeducational. And obviously I was not here yet, but I know from reading the history just how difficult a decision that was. The board considered it once or twice in the decade or two before, and chose to remain all male. In the mid 80s, finally made that decision, and I think it turned out to be prescient, and it turned out to help illustrate this distinction between a core value that doesn't change and a long-standing institutional feature or tradition that does change, maybe in fact precisely to preserve that core value. So in this case, the best argument or one of the most important arguments was that academic quality at the institution was beginning to suffer because the market for all male institutions was shrinking, and the caliber of student that W&L could attract as an all-male institution was diminishing. Not only was half the population excluded because women were not eligible to apply, but probably at least half of the men in the universe were not interested in an all-male institution. So the application pool was shrinking, admitting women almost instantaneously raised academic standards discernibly and dramatically, and really enabled the institution to persist as the thing it had always been, which was an institution aspiring to provide the very highest quality liberal arts education, which it couldn't have done indefinitely if it remained all male.
So do you see it as a hierarchy of values, that conflicting values where one superseded the other?
I mean, I guess it depends on whether you think of all maleness as a value. I'm not sure if I think of that as a value as much as a characteristic. And I guess I do think.
Well, at the time, I would assume that they would have thought of that as we might not see that today,
right? But
I would assume at the time that was probably pretty core.
Yes, it certainly was core to the identity of the institution.
Like, as in, so the question of it's a value or not is it a feature and a strategy, or is it something that's core to identity, right? So a feature and a strategy would be if we want to change this marketing material, or if we want to change tuition prices. You wouldn't say that tuition prices is not core to identity. It's something that is used. It's a tool. But the higher order value would be education, would be diversity, would be whatever that item is.
Right. I suppose I suppose that example illustrates having to make a difficult decision is what reveals your priorities, right? And I think the trustees, in making that decision, which I think was an excellent decision, as difficult as it was for them, revealed that they did in fact place a higher priority on academic excellence over the long term than they placed on the identity as an all-male institution. And I think part of my job involves talking to alumni all over the country, and I've talked to thousands of them, and there are very, very few who, at the time, I think roughly 80% of alumni disagreed with the decision.
Disagreed? Wow.
Disagreed.
Okay.
It was a very unpopular decision with the alumni. Fortunately, there wasn't social media, there wasn't email, it was a very unpopular decision. The alumni, if the alumni had gotten to, if it was decided by alumni vote, it would not have happened. And the trustees had the courage to say, this is important enough for the institution to be the most excellent version of itself, that they did it despite knowing the alumni, the majority of the alumni were opposed. Today, 35 years later, almost every alum I've met recognizes that it was the right decision. In fact, and there are some great examples of some individual alumni who at the time were vociferously opposed, and not very long later made very significant gifts to the university, acknowledging how mistaken they had been. Interesting.
Yeah, because when you establish values, when you put your foot down on a value line, there's going to be some really upset people.
Yes, there are. And, and sometimes you're going to lose those people, right? There are going to be some people who are upset enough and for whom a particular value is core enough that you lose them. And, as the president of Washington and Lee, I would like to keep everybody in the family feeling as good as possible about the institution. But one of the features of the job is that you cannot possibly make everybody happy because people's perspectives are so widely divergent. And so you try to understand the core values of the place well enough, and listen to as many people as you can as well as possible, and then do the things that you think will enable the institution to be the best version of itself, and just recognize that some people will see it differently.
Do you have an example?
Do I have an example? Well,
coeducation is a great example. From your tenure.
I understand.
You have not had anything quite like
I understand what you're fishing for, but yes, no, I have not had anything quite like coeducation. But I mean, in my time here, we have spent a lot of time talking, thinking, figuring out how to address issues of institutional history, which are prominent in America these days in a lot of different respects. I started here 6 months before the events in Charlottesville. Charlottesville is just over an hour away. Thinking about, I've tried to keep people focused on our educational mission. And what I'm interested in is thinking about how can we do the very best job possible teaching and presenting the institutional history of this place, which includes receiving a significant gift from George Washington to help it get off the ground, and having Robert E. Lee be the president of the place for the final 5 years of his life after the Civil War. And of course, he's buried on campus, and he died in the house that I live in. There's some significant history here that our country is revisiting and grappling with. And I've tried very hard to approach those issues as thoughtfully as possible, but there are lots of people who are less than perfectly satisfied with my approach. Both people who would like to see more dramatic changes, and people who would like to see no changes at all. And I'm not saying I've done it perfectly, but I'm trying to chart the course as well as I can, and I'm well aware that I can't possibly satisfy everybody. How's that for an example?
That was awesome.
Okay.
I want to close out with just a few rapid fire questions.
Okay, great.
All right. If you could bring any philosopher back to life, who would it be and why?
Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, because I've spent more time trying to make sense of his fascinating works than anybody else. And I would just love to meet him and have a conversation.
Do you consider yourself to be utilitarian?
I do not, no.
Why not?
Because I guess my own intellectual underpinnings are in the Kant Hegel tradition, and there's an intuition there that there are some principles that are not necessarily grounded in utility or the maximization of happiness. There might be other things that are sometimes more important.
What's been the most challenging and the most rewarding part of being a university president?
I think it's going to be two sides of the same coin, which is that I mean, even though we're a small place, or maybe especially because we're a small place, people associated with Washington and Lee, and that's probably 25,000 people when you include living alumni and faculty and staff and students, they all feel a very powerful connection to this place, a passion for this place, and with that, a sense of ownership of this place. So my job involves constituency management, and those constituencies have overlapping interests and desires, but they're also quite different from each other. And so working with each of those constituencies and trying to help all of them feel sufficiently good about the university and to feel like we're moving in a direction that they are excited about is a challenge. On the other hand, the flip side is it's really rewarding and energizing to have 25,000 people who love the institution that you're leading, and most of whom are willing to give very generously of their time and their energy and their financial resources to support what we're doing. So, yeah.
All right, last one. I saw on your CV that you were a debater in the highly esteemed Latke versus Hamantaschen debate, who, for those who don't know, is a debate over which of two Jewish foods is the best one. I assume that you backed Latke's, right? Is that the one that you?
I did not back the Latke, but to be honest, I was assigned.
I won't hold it against you.
I was assigned the Hamantaschen, and I defended it on Kantian grounds, which it would take me a while to reconstruct. But yes, I had a great time doing that.
All right. Well, that's that.
Right.
Really, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It was a lot of fun.
I was glad to do it. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.